Let's talk today about multicolor knitting. This includes Fairisle and Intarsia. This one is Fairisle, this one is Intarsia, and this one is Fairisle. Now the difference is not really based on how they look on the front of the work. The back tells the tale. Those strands indicate that it's Fairisle, because one way to think of it is that Fairisle has strands. It's sometimes even called stranded knitting, because both colors of yarn are carried across the loom at the same time, but only one is knitted per stitch. These are called floats. It's short down here where it only had to cross 1 to 3 stitches when not in use, and it's much, much longer up here where we had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 white stitches and the green was carried across. It's perfectly acceptable to have these strands in some circumstances. If I were making a pillow cover, we really wouldn't care. Those strands would be hidden next to the puffiness of the pillow. We don't need it to stretch, so it would be fine. But see how limiting the strands are? For socks, we would probably choose either a design like this one that had shorter floats, or we would go with Fairisle. I said that wrong, sorry. Intarsia. By definition, Intarsia is separate balls of yarn for each color block, and it produces this effect, because every time we come to the end of our series of single color stitches, we wrap the two yarns together, otherwise we would get a hole. And I'm going to show you all that. So you get to choose to some degree, because I could have knitted with my white yarn, knitted with my green yarn, picked up the same strand of white yarn, and kept on knitting. But that would have produced white yarn stretched across the green triangle on the back. Most people find that's a little bit quicker, so if it won't matter, you may want to do it that way. But this is the way to preserve the stretch and avoid those floats. If it was, say, a sock or the sleeve of a sweater, sticking your fingers and toes in past these long floats is hazardous. You'll damage the fabric and possibly hurt a digit. This sample, by the way, was made using the ordinary Kiss U-wrap on this loom. And this sample is being developed on, this is a small KB loom. It works just the same on Nifty Knitters and on Cindywood looms. One way that we can decide whether to use Fairisle and strand the knitting or Intarsia is the size of the design. The top design there is the one that is already present on this loom. And you can see how long the floats will be before you ever start. Let me try to get this adjusted so it shows up better. Perhaps if I put that, yeah, you can see it. The light didn't want to catch it. If I have 1, 2, 3 brown stitches, then behind those 3 brown stitches is the strand of the alternate color, white in this case. And now I have 1 white stitch, so the brown will be spanning that area with a float or a strand. And up on the next row, if these are white stitches, there will be a longer strand of brown and a short strand of white behind these brown stitches. Generally, 2 or 3 stitch long floats don't create nearly the problem that 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 and larger stitch floats create. Therefore, many Fairisle designs are this kind of thing, small. When you outline like this, as I did here, when you get to the middle, you've got long floats. And there we do. This is the outlined one. So this design could be made either way. I could have had, working over here, a ball of white here a ball of green. Then on the next segment, I would have needed a second ball of white, a second ball of green, and a third ball of white. And in that way, I would have gotten no floats or strands. This kind of design with a good-sized block of one color is almost always done as Intarsia. And this one would require one ball of white, one ball of green, one ball of white. So let's do some actual knitting. It's going to be difficult for me to show you the chart and knit at the same time. So I've made this chart very, very simple. We're going to do the Intarsia first, beginning with one contrasting color stitch for the first row. The second and third rows have 3. The fourth row has 5. The fifth row has 7, and then we reduce back down. And each row is done with the same technique. So I'm going to set the chart aside so we can focus on the knitting. I still have yarn attached here from my Fairisle sample down here. So we'll just start with it. We already know that I need that center stitch. And of course, I have an even number of stitches, so it won't be perfectly centered, but we won't worry about that. I want that to be the contrasting color. Now the knitting up to it, we're using the E-wrap here, but it works the same with any version of knit stitch. We're going to knit up to it in white, and because I'm talking to you at the same time as knitting, I'm going to go ahead and knit over. Although very often when I'm by myself, I wrap the entire row before knitting over, but I don't have a spare hand right now to control my floats. Now here is where we need another ball of yarn. We're going to begin by knotting a loop into it so that it gets started on the loom in the way that you nearly always do. We've got my contrasting stitch knitted. That will become a stitch, and then we'll knit on to the left and knit them all over. Whoops, I missed one. Let me stop and fix that. So let's knit with this ball of white yarn, which I'm going to put back out of the way, and you will know that on the left side of the loom, that's the ball I'm drawing from. We're going to knit the first 3 stitches because they should be white according to our chart. This is perfectly normal. The next 3 should be brown. But before I wrap the brown, I'm going to take the ball of white and pass it under the brown strand. So see them forming a little knot? That's the knot. It's not really a knot, it's just a twist, and that is what will prevent the hole in the knitting. Now we wrap the 3 brown stitches and knit them over. This stitch got long because it's still attached to the yarn supply over here. And so I just need to tighten it up, that's all. Now we need these 2 to be wrapped. I've got 2 larger balls here, and ideally I would have made them smaller. But out of your vision, I'm just lifting them around one another, and you will see the results. There we go. Now we won't get a hole, and I can finish the row with the white. And every row in an Intarsia project goes like this. We'll do one more so that you get comfortable with it. We'll go from right to left now. By the way, I'm slipping the first peg. These are the only 2 stitches that need to be... Nope, I'm sorry. On my chart, there are 2 rows where there are 3 brown stitches. so these same stitches will be knitted in brown, but that doesn't get me off the hook for wrapping the yarns. Out of your field of vision, I've wrapped them, and you can see the results. There's my little twist. 1, 2, 3. Now it's time to use the small ball of yarn that's on the left, but before I do, take it around the brown strand. I've got a twist. Now the spot where it twists, you don't want to pull it overly tight, but neither do you want to let extra slack get into the stitch. So you tension it with your hand so that it maintains the normal amount of yarn per stitch. That's the easiest way of thinking about it. And there we go. You can see it just beginning to develop. Now we're going to change and knit this, the next row, as Fairisle. And you'll be able to see what I'm talking about the similarities and differences. We're on the left. Those 2 stitches are meant to be white. These next 5 should be brown. And because of it being my very first row of changing, I am wrapping them, because the brown yarn already sitting in the middle would have created a hole. Normally it's carried all the way across the loom. So we go 5 stitches across, knit them over. We're going to ignore this yarn because that was involved in the Intarsia plan. Now we've switched to the Fairisle plan just to contrast them. And in Fairisle, we just bring this yarn across the brown, the white yarn we started with, and knit the last stitches. Next row, we need 7, not 5 brown stitches. There are 2 ways you can do this, and I'm going to use one of them. I could bring this yarn all the way down and wrap it on the end peg and then start back. That will create an extra float here, but it will also keep the edge even so that we can sew this brown into the seam if we want to. But I have decided I'm going to do it a little bit differently. I'm just going to wrap the 7. Normal knitting. And this row, the float that is created when we come across with the white will really show up. Here's our white working yarn. We're only knitting this stitch because on the chart, others are brown. I've already wrapped them and knitted them. So I bring my white all the way over past them. And you can see what's happening. Now we're going to change up again. Normally, this is not a design with a solid triangle that you would make floats that long. There are reasons that you might, which is why I demonstrated it, and it will beautifully show up the difference between the 2 techniques. But let's go back and do a more typical Fairisle design, which is this, which has short floats automatically. Let's see. So we're going to be working this design, which, take note, is a repeat of 4. Actually, I'm showing 2 repeats, but it takes 4 stitches to complete the design, even though only 3 of one color are in the longest row, because the 4th of a contrasting color is part of the design. So this kind of thing is good for socks. Very often we have a multiple of 4 in our socks, and we could do this all the way around the sock tops. So that's what I'll be doing, and we begin, if you note, with every 4th stitch. You could read this chart either top to bottom or bottom to top, but reading bottom to top is traditional. 1, 2, 3, 4. And I'm going to position it a certain way on the loom just to make sure that I do get 2 repeats so that you can look at it. I did a couple of plain rows in between to avoid creating confusion. And I broke this yarn and took it off so we can start it again as we normally would. Generally, you want to begin with both of the yarns on one side of the loom. That knot didn't work very well. Hang on. There we go. I'm just going to hang this on there to anchor it, and I'll knit them off together. It's not part of the pattern. I just need it anchored. I'm pulling out a little slack in the brown because I needed some. Okay, let's begin. I had these twisted, sorry about that. That's stitch 1, 2 and 3 are white. Now time to knit with brown. 4. That's just my yarn tail I'm getting out of the way. Now, as I said, but as a reminder, I would normally have wrapped this whole row, but I can't control it from behind the camera as I would if it was in my lap. So I'm going across stitch by stitch. 3 whites. Pick up the other strand, carry it across, 1 brown. And we finish with 3 whites. And for this sample, I think that I will use the second option with stranded knitting. Bring this around and wrap it just so my seams will be the same. Now, return trip, we only get 1 white. This is the row on the chart that has 3 brown stitches in a row. 1, 2, 3. And remember, you don't have to use E-wrap. Any knit stitch will work. Of course, it will have the difference of appearance that they always have. Time for 3 more browns. And we finish the row with white. And I'm going to bring my brown to the end and wrap it just to anchor it. Return trip, this row gets whites in a row again. So this row, I need that 1 brown stitch, now 3 white stitches in a row. Now pick up the brown yarn, carry it across, wrap. Here's a trick that's so simple. getting the tension right is just a matter of making sure that when you carry your yarn across, you don't pull it as tight as you possibly can. See the yarn stretching? Wrong. You don't leave it slack and loose. You just pull it smooth. That's all there is to it. Fairisle is never going to be as stretchy as plain stockinette because those floats will prevent it. A knit stitch is stretchy. A float is not. And if I were going to continue, I'd wrap this and return. But I have made one complete pattern. So what I'm going to do instead is knit a couple rows of white so we can get this off of the loom and have a look. Let's look at what we achieved. Starting with this diamond square, we did the bottom of it. And on the front, remember we did this two ways. You can't tell from the front that it was done in two different ways, but in the back it will be obvious. Let's get away the strands that have nothing to do with our work here. This one is where I carried it up from the work below, as we talked about. This one is where the spare ball of white began. So at the bottom we were doing Intarsia, and you can see the twists where the two colors wrap around each other. This was one ball of white, one ball of brown, one ball of white. Then I trimmed off this ball and set it aside and kept going with the other ball, and we did it as Fairisle. And this float are what resulted. And as we discussed, if you have a project that's going to have a backing on it, wall hanging, pillow, a decoration of some sort, this is not a problem. In a garment, it is. So you can see how similar the effect is on the front, Intarsia, Fairisle, but how different it is in structure actually. Then we did Fairisle for the smaller pattern. Let me hold this a little smoother. There are substantial floats. The longest ones are 3 stitches wide. You can see how much less of a problem the 1-stitch floats would create. Personally, on this gauge, I still would be loath to use it on a garment. I think they would still be in the way. Unless, of course, you did it inside a hem. If the fabric was turned up covering this area and the floats were hidden, as on a hat brim, it would be no problem at all. And on the front, we get the same pattern that is penciled in at the top. I would like to point out something, because sometimes this bothers people. Stitches are pretty much symmetrical side to side. On an E-wrap, not perfectly so, because one leg of the stitch wraps over the other, but they still make little V's. But because they make little V's, they are not symmetrical top to bottom. So even though we drew this, and it looks exactly the same, it will never form exactly that look, because we've got a point down here and a curve, and then it disappears behind the next stitch on the top. And you can turn that to advantage as a design feature. Just don't expect perfect symmetry. And here is the one I did before you got to watch. This is a finished piece of this stuff. Now let's go ahead and compare it to the one done with the U-stitch on the Kiss loom. This loom was set to a much larger gauge, so that was on purpose to allow me to use the green, which is a thicker yarn. Normally you would not purposely use thicker yarns, you would want them both the same, but I thought in this case it would help me demonstrate what was going on, because these two yarns happen to show the twisting together very well, and how even at this basically an overly loose gauge for the white yarn, you are not getting any holes where these colors connect. One more thing, and then you'll be ready to do your own. These are the kinds of charts that we normally do follow for 2-color knitting. And actually, 3 and 4-color knitting is also possible, but start with 2-color knitting. Fill in the squares that you want in a contrasting color, and then count up, as I was doing. You really got to watch me do it. Row 1 gets all white, 1 contrasting, remaining white. Row 2 and 3 get 3 stitches, and so on. It makes it very easy to visualize. You can also create graph paper that is exactly proportioned like a knit stitch. A knit stitch doesn't really take up a square. In actual fact, if this was our knit stitch, it would be about that big. Between 60 and 75% of the width. That's what the height is. The height is 60 to 75% of the width on most version of knit stitches. Therefore, everything that you knit based on a perfectly square chart will end up looking a little bit shorter and fatter in proportion. And to avoid that, if you want to know exactly what you're going to get, you can make yourself graph paper that is proportioned just like your knit stitches. But this is not really very hard. You're ready to go. Have some fun.